They're the windows to the soul. They are the part of the portrait I love painting most, and I bet you're probably drawn to them as well. So let's talk about the most common mistakes that we make when painting eyes and what to do instead to take your portraiture to the next level. So first things first, most people paint the white of the eye too white and too light in value. So our eyelid isn't a paper-thin covering over our eyes. It has bulk. It reaches over the top of our eyeball like an awning, and as a result, it casts a shadow over the sclera, or so-called white of the eye. By the way, I'm probably going to call it the white of the eye throughout this video, but I think it might be helpful to distance yourself from calling it that because it creates this unconscious or maybe even conscious association that the white of the eye is in fact white, which is never going to be true. Our eye has all kinds of things happening inside of it. There's blood vessels, there's pigmentation. It's never going to be actually white. So perhaps shifting to calling it the sclera might be helpful, just in encouraging you not to think about it as being too white or too light. Okay, so we know that the upper eyelid casts a shadow down on the eye itself. On top of that, the color of what we see in the world anywhere isn't just informed by the local color of that object. So when I say local color, I mean if I talk about a lemon, you think yellow. If I'm talking about an orange, you think orange. So if I put a lemon and an orange next to one another on a table, you will see some of the orange bouncing into the yellow of the lemon. And you will see some of the yellow from the lemon bouncing into the orange. If you want to test this, you can set these two objects up on a table next to one another and insert a white index card between them. You should see the color of the reflected light in each object change when you move the index card from being between them or when you remove that index card. You should be able to see that slight change of the light, and you should be able to see some of the color of whatever fruit is more visible to you bouncing into that index card when you do have them between those two objects. So now that we've talked a little bit about how that bouncing or reflected light works, we can apply it to the eye because the same thing is happening in the white of our eyes. Some of our skin tone is bouncing into them, which will darken the value, and it will probably make the color less saturated as well. As a result, one shortcut I've heard for painting the eyes is to block them in with the color of the flesh tone for that area. And then you might cool that flesh tone off just slightly with a light blue or gray. This can act as a really helpful starting point, but of course you don't want to think about any color in painting as a formula. You don't want to think about, okay, I'm painting flesh tone, so I'm going to grab the Caucasian flesh tone tube of paint from my paint kit. Or I'm going to use my standard flesh tone formula to mass in this flesh tone. There is no one color for anything in painting. So while I am talking about this shortcut to help you avoid thinking of the sclera or white of the eye as being too white or too light, just know that this is context dependent and that formula is simply a jumping off point. So just to recap, you might want to start by thinking about the white of your eye as simply a slightly cooler flesh tone rather than going in with white or a really light color mixture compared to the skin. The other thing you're going to want to keep in mind is that there is a shadow cast by the upper lid as well as the eyelashes. That's going to mean that the sclera is darker as you go higher up on the visible part of the eyeball. The next most common mistake that I see in painting eyes has to do with thinking of the eye as a feature or as a symbol. And let me break down what I mean by that. You might recall from one of my recent videos with Devin Corwin, this conversation we had where we were discussing optical versus conceptual or constructive ways of thinking. And one other way of thinking is symbolically. So if we're thinking optically, We are going to look at an object that's in front of us, and we're going to consider the way the light and shadow pattern can be flattened into a set of two-dimensional shapes. Kind of like, how does the light and how does the shadow, how do they fit together like a bunch of jigsaw puzzle pieces to create the image we see before us? This is a pretty standard fine art way of thinking, and this is largely what I have been taught to do. And it doesn't matter whether you are painting the eye or the nose or random musculature in the arm. All you are thinking about is where's the light and where's the shadow. You don't care if there's an eyelash, or you don't care about the iris in the eye. You don't care about necessarily capturing the nostrils and the nose. You are simply paying attention to where's that edge between light and shadow, and if you are faithful in constructing those shapes, you should come away with an image that looks like you've really faithfully captured all of those features without you actually having to think about the feature itself. By contrast, if you're thinking conceptually or constructively, you might be thinking about the anatomy of the face and trying to make sure that you're staying faithful to the three-dimensional structures and forms of that anatomy. So you might be drawing an eye and think about the planes of the upper and lower lid and making sure you capture those accurately and really paying attention to the structure of the eye socket and brow ridge that you're painting in. Now we can take this one step further and we can think about the features of the face or the eye specifically symbolically. This is what you get when you ask a child to draw an eye, or when you think about Egyptian hieroglyphs and how the eye might have been depicted then. You know, it's your pretty standard arc for the upper lash line. You're going to have some lines going out of it. For the eyelashes, you're going to draw a circle for the iris and another arcing line below for the lower lash line. And don't forget those eyelashes on the bottom. We might know intellectually that this isn't how we want to depict the eye when we are painting, but that doesn't mean we don't kind of fall back into this way of thinking from time to time. And we do things like paint individual eyelashes and over-exaggerate them, even if they aren't visible in the reference we're painting from. This also kind of brings us back to that first trap that we often fall victim to, which is thinking of the white of the eye as white, thinking of the iris as being super round and being able to see all the way around the circle of the iris. And again, really emphasizing individual lashes to make it clear that this is an eye. Now, this is probably something where there are instances where you really know better than to do this, and there are instances where this might still be sneaking up on you and you aren't aware of it. So think about a portrait where you have one eye that's on the light side of the face and the other eye is completely enveloped in shadow. What we all will naturally do is really try to paint that eye that's in shadow anyway, even if we cannot see it in the reference. We really want to show that it's there. We want to show the white of the eye. We want to show the eyelashes on that side. And so we're going to exaggerate what we're trying to depict here rather than letting some of the features disappear. And I think this is really the crux of the matter. We want to show each individual feature of the eye that we think of as making it an eye. We want to show the eyelashes. We want to show the white of the eye. We want to show the iris. We want to show the highlight. We want to show all parts of the upper and lower lid, even when they aren't visible or should not be visible in what we're painting. What I found is the easiest remedy for this is to really go back to an optical way of thinking for this particular problem. Really pay attention to how much of the eye you can actually see and give yourself permission to omit the rest of those structures. If when you back up and squint, you lose large parts of the eye in shadow, do not paint them. And really encourage yourself to make your painting work without having that superfluous information in there. Now, the third common pitfall in painting eyes that I see is actually something that affects the whole face, but it really bears mentioning here, and that is, as humans, we naturally really like to square up faces when we paint. We do not like painting them at angles. Whether the eye line is level, but we're kind of looking at the face from a 3/4 view, Or we have a little bit of an angle both on the vertical and horizontal axis, so the eye line isn't level and we aren't looking this person square on as we paint them. What happens with the eyes is that we try too hard to make both of the eyes symmetrical. And in the process, we wind up squaring up the eyes and they look like they no longer belong on the face, or the face no longer is being depicted at the angle that we're seeing it at. So if this is something that has been affecting your work, what I would really encourage you to do is to start off in your block-in stage by drawing midlines through the face. Draw a vertical midline that runs down the middle of the forehead, right between the brows, in the middle of the lip, and in the middle of the chin. And then the other midline you are going to draw is going to run roughly between the inner and outer corners of the eyes. Now, this won't be perfect. Some people have tilt to their eye shape so that one corner is higher than the other. But you generally want to think of this as an average and really do what you can to make sure that this horizontal midline is as accurate as possible. This is going to help you to avoid that situation where you have one eye that's rendered really beautifully and it feels like it's in the right place, and then you go to paint the second eye and it just doesn't seem to match and it doesn't look like it's on the same person. Once you have this midline established to make sure that the symmetry is working, you can give yourself permission to paint each eye in the correct perspective. So even if they aren't going to be the same shape because you don't have the same vantage point on each eye, that's okay. They should start to feel like they belong on the same face. And this brings me to the final, most common flaw I see in painting eyes in portraits, which is painting the white of the eye too white, light, or largely. The reason why we tend to think of the highlight in the eye as being white is that most often when we're looking at somebody and we see that highlight in their eye, it is contrasting against the black of their pupil. And this makes us believe, because there's so much contrast, that that highlight must be white. But it's worth remembering that this highlight is light that's reflecting from somewhere. And unless you have a vividly intense light that is lighting your model and it's right in front of their eye, chances are this light is going to be something like the blue of the sky, or it's going to be an interior light that's bounced around your room quite a bit and lost a little bit of that strength. It's had other colors kind of influencing it. But whatever the reason, what is most important here is that by the time that highlight is interacting with the eye, so that our eye as the painter perceives it, it is very rarely going to be that bright. In fact, one thing that can be really helpful is to intentionally paint the highlight in the eye darker than you think it needs to be and see how well the painting works. If it really does look too dim, you can always brighten it a little bit more. But if you take a look at the highlight in the eyes of some of your favorite paintings, you should start to notice that what makes it feel really bright is the darkness of the context around that highlight and the fact that it's very small with a very hard edge around it. That can really up our perception of the contrast and make us believe that the highlight is lighter than it actually is. If, as you have gone through this video, you find that one or more of these applies to you, know that you are absolutely not alone in this. I took my idea for this video from conversations that I've had with my own students. These are very common pitfalls when painting portraits, and the great news is that because as viewers we fixate on the eyes so much when we look at someone's portrait, if we can just correct these few things and make sure we're on the lookout for them, it should really have a disproportionately positive effect on the paintings that you make. And if that's something that's important to you and you would like to have more support and more feedback like this, I would encourage you to look into my mentorship program. This is the kind of feedback that I give students every day, and I absolutely love helping artists to take their portraiture to the next level while keeping their work loose and expressive. To find out more, there's a link regarding my mentorships down in the description, as well as a link to apply to see if you and I are a fit to work together. All right, until next time, happy painting.